good afternoon. Welcome, everybody. I am Hadar Susskind, President and CEO of Americans for Peace Now. And for those of you who are regulars on our webinars, you know that this is the part where I talk for 10 or 15 seconds to wait as everybody signs in, and it takes a moment or two. So in just a minute, I will introduce our wonderful guest, and we will get going. But first, just a little bit of housekeeping. I want to remind everybody that we are recording this, which means that the video will be available on our YouTube channel, and you can find it on our website. And we will also take the audio and edit that into a podcast episode. So if you want to come back and watch or listen to this later, you'll have that available. If you want to share it with friends and colleagues who didn't have the chance, you will be able to do so. So again, I'm just going to say welcome. I'm Hadar Susskind, President and CEO of Americans for Peace Now. Before I introduce our wonderful guest, I do want to take just a minute to acknowledge what I'm sure we're all sitting with today, which is the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And it is not the core of our work. We're not going to spend our time talking about it. But as an organization that literally has peace in its name, I think, I know I and my colleagues, and I'm sure all of you have been watching, frankly, with sadness, with horror, as this unfolds. And I think we are all just hoping, praying, if that's your thing, that this comes to a hopefully peaceful conclusion as soon as possible. So with that, I'm going to move on to the topic of our conversation today. And first, I am going to welcome our guest, Rabbi Jill Jacobs, the CEO of Truah. I am not going to read Jill's long and very impressive bio, because I'm sure that you all know Jill, but I just want to say on a personal note, Truah and Jill are wonderful friends and have been wonderful partners and allies in all of our work, but particularly in the work around addressing anti-Semitism, addressing the weaponization of anti-Semitism, and helping people, Jews and non-Jews, elected officials, everybody we work with, understand those lines and understand how to navigate what for a lot of people is really very tricky terrain. And so Jill and her colleagues at Truah have just put out a wonderful new resource. I believe Ori just posted it in the chat to everyone, the guide to Truah's very brief guide to anti-Semitism. So if you haven't seen it, you can find it there. And one more housekeeping thing that I just remembered before I hand it to Jill is, as usual, we will be taking questions through the Q&A function. So as we're talking, as you think of things, go ahead and post them in there, and we will, of course, get to as many as you can. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Jill to please, share with us a little more about this great resource you guys just put out.
Thanks so much, Hadar. I want to, first of all, echo what Hadar said, that we're all just watching the news with horror and thinking about the people in Ukraine. And so even though we're talking about something else for this moment, I know that's for sure in our minds and in our prayers. We do, at Truah, we can unequivocally recommend prayer. So we'll do that. And also just to say that Hadar and I worked together in different contexts for many, many years. And it's really wonderful to work together with Hadar at Americans for Peace Now, which has been a partner for a long time. And I think our relationship is even getting stronger. So that's really wonderful. So let me say a word about this Anti-Semitism booklet. Thank you, Ori, for putting it in the chat. When you go to that link, you'll see that you can either download it for free, or you can also order packets. If you order the printed copy, it's very small. It's like 1/4 of a page. So it's something you can literally stick in your pocket or your bag and hand it out and share it with people. So we created this booklet because we recognize that there is a lot of confusion around anti-Semitism. I'll maybe start with a story that I was talking to a reporter. I think this was, it was either not long after Charlottesville or not long after the shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue. And I was talking to this reporter from a secular publication. She herself wasn't Jewish. And she said to me something like, well, I'm so confused because I thought that anti-Semitism ended after the Holocaust. And she said, do you think anti-Semitism could end? Like, can we end it in the next few years? And as somebody who grew up in the Jewish community, very steeped in the history of anti-Semitism, I was kind of taken aback that she even had this question. and realized in that moment that for a lot of people, anti-Semitism begins and ends with the Holocaust. So for a lot of people who maybe aren't steeped in that history, there's a sense of everything was fine, and then there was the Holocaust, and now everything's fine again, which of course has nothing to do with the actual history of Jews and anti-Semitism. But there is a lot of misunderstanding about and lack of understanding about the history. And so we decided to put this out for a few reasons. So one is to give people a very easy to read, very short outline of Jewish history. You'll see that we just touch on multiple topics, each of which could be, and in fact are, their own books or multiple books. So we talk about just history of anti-Semitism from ancient times until modern times in different countries and different places. We talk about some typical stereotypes of Jews. We talk about some images. You'll see that there's images in there that represent some of the stereotypes and anti-Semitic tropes. And so we give a very brief history, and then we talk specifically about the line between anti-Semitism and criticizing Israel, which is probably the most hotly debated topic. And I know we're going to dive much more into this. So we talk about Israel and Zionism, again, very briefly, like one sentence where there are books and books, and then talk about where we see that line. And the other thing is that we, throughout the book, we situate this in the context of fighting all kinds of bigotry. So it's not that anti-Semitism stands alone, but we want to fight anti-Semitism in the context of fighting white supremacy, in the context of fighting against racism and other kinds of bigotries, not to separate ourselves out, because we very much feel like the way that we can create a better world for all of us is for all of us to be fighting against racism, anti-Semitism, and xenophobia, Islamophobia, et cetera, across lines of race, across lines of ethnicity, nationality, et cetera. And then finally, we include some suggestions for dealing with anti-Semitism when it emerges in our communities, particularly when we're trying to do work that crosses those boundaries. So how we can respond with emotional intelligence, how we can respond in a way that recognizes the impact on different people in the community, and what some of our options are for moving forward. So that's the booklet. Like I said, it's very short. If you download it, it's just a full-size paper, but I think only about 9 or 10 pages. If you buy the copies, then it's about 30-ish pages, but like a quarter size. And the idea is that it's something that that you can put out. Let's say if you're a part of a synagogue, it could be out on the table when you walk in. For those of us who are going physically in person to those places, it's something that the college students could use in tabling. It's something that you could just have a few in your pocket to hand to your friend or your colleague, that rabbis can use it to share with clergy of other religions. That it's something that's just very easy to just hand people. So you'll see also that there's options to get the printed copies in groups of, I think, 20, because we do want people to not only have one for themselves, but also hand them out to others. So that's the overall introduction. We can talk more specifically about any of that.
That's great. Thank you, Jill. First of all, I just say, when you're thinking about the list of people who they should be handed out to, I would include, and your congressman, because we know there are a lot of people on Capitol Hill who could use a little education around this subject, that's for sure. So yeah, I spent some time looking through the digital version, and I think it's just, it's really, first of all, I love the title, a very brief guide to anti-Semitism, because obviously there are and will continue to be, many, many books and long writings on the topic. And we know that not many people are going to get through those, unfortunately. And this guide, I think, is really, it's practical, and it helps people understand some of the questions that I think come up the most often. And, I'm going to, for the moment, skip past, although it is worth everyone's time to look at sort of the history and, looking at religious anti-Semitism and political anti-Semitism and some of the background that you guys provide, which is important, but to get to the issue that is for us, I think, really the heart of the work, which is when questions around Israel come up and people being critical of Israeli policy, or I will include, and I actually really want to applaud you guys for addressing this, critical of Israel itself, because one of the key questions is, okay, some people say, well, it's fine, you can be critical of what Israel says, but if you're anti-Zionist, then that is explicitly in and of itself anti-Semitic. So I think that's actually my first question I'd like you to talk about is, is that line of anti-Zionism, and what do you think, and how do you talk to people about that?
Sure. Well, the question that I always want to ask first is, well, what do people mean by Zionism? Because people mean all sorts of different things by Zionism. So Zionism can mean the movement to create the state of Israel in 1948. And if Zionism means that, then the word actually should have been obsolete after 1948, which, by the way, is what I think. But
much like the Janus, but yes.
Yes, well, that's a separate.
Sorry, that was last week's webinar. For those of you who
right.
missed it, you can catch the video. Yeah.
For some people, Zionism means that Jews have a right to live in our ancestral homeland. For some people, it means that the state of Israel has a right to exist. That's a complicated question about whether any state has a right to exist, because obviously states have gotten chopped up and recombined even in our lifetimes. For some people, yeah, well, let's wait to see what happens there. Right. But yes.
Sorry.
And so, right, so Zionism can, for some people, Zionism means that Jews can basically do whatever they want in the West Bank and kick out Palestinians and take over homes. And right, so Zionism means lots of different things, and we need to interrogate that, first of all. So I want to just not say, well, anti-Zionism always means one thing or another. For some people, it's about having a diasporist identity. It's all sorts of things. But the question that I always, because like the temperature around Israel, of course, always gets very heated. And often when I talk about Israel in this line, I start by saying, well, Israel is a country, which is perhaps an obvious statement, but not always an obvious statement, because we don't always act like Israel is a country. So for some of us, particularly in the Jewish community, Israel is we sometimes act like Israel is an extension of our own identity. And so anything that's about Israel, we take personally. So it's maybe less of a real country where real people live and like go to work and go to school and eat breakfast, and more of an extension of some identity kind of fantasy. For some people, the Israel takes on this is where you get into anti-Semitic territory, when Israel takes on this kind of greater power and absorbs some of the anti-Semitic stereotypes about Jews as being this octopus or controlling the world. And so Israel also takes on more power than any country perhaps has. So it's important to say, well, Israel is a country, and their decision was made for once Israel and the Jewish people made the decision that Israel would be an actual country and a member of the United Nations, then it's subject to all the same laws as every other member of the United Nations, which means international law, including laws of occupation and other international law. And so because our temperatures are always so elevated around Israel, it's helpful, I think, to try to substitute any other country. So when we think about the United States, which is the easiest country probably for any of us to substitute, when we think about the United States, it was created on the genocide of Native Americans, and it was created through enslaving people from Africa. And that is, to use a Christian term, the original sin, or the maybe dual original sins of the United States. And then, of course, there have been, we just multiplied all of that. So Manifest Destiny, moving westward and taking over Native American land. And so there's many really horrible events at the foundation of the United States and at the expansion of the United States. And it's a fair question and a really important question to ask how we're going to do, in Jewish terms, cheshbon nefesh, or a real soul searching about that history, and also how we're going to do reparations and how we can do real tshuva that moves forward. Like, those are really crucial questions for the United States to be asking. And it doesn't mean, if I'm asking those questions, it doesn't mean that I'm anti-American, and it doesn't mean that I think that everybody who's not Native American in this country should get up and go to wherever their ancestors came from, as though that were even possible. And so also when we talk about Israel, there were things that happened in 1948 through the war that Palestinians call the Nakba, that Israelis call the War of Independence, that hundreds of thousands of Palestinians lost their homes and became refugees, and Israel did lots of things to make sure that they couldn't come back. And about 1% of the Jewish population was killed during that war. The 1% of the Jewish population of the time was killed during that war. And so there are really horrible things that happened. And it is really important that Israel go back and do that kind of cheshbon nefesh and think about what it means to do tshuva, hopefully moving forward into a long-term peace agreement. But asking those questions, asking basic questions about how and where, how Israel was created, what happened at the creation, that is not inherently anti-Semitic, just like asking basic questions about, even posing the question, would it have been better if Europeans had never landed in what is now the United States? Maybe, right? Like you can create a counterfactual, but the real question is, well, what do we do now? And so asking those questions is not anti-Semitic. Now, where you move into anti-Semitic territory is when you start to say, well, all the Israeli Jews should just go back to where they came from, which first, there's many Israeli Jews who descend from, there was a Jewish community in what is now Israel for forever, but also most Israeli Jews could not go back to Poland or Iraq or wherever their families might have come from, and most Israeli Jews have no other citizenship. So once you are proposing creating a refugee problem of 7 million Jews, now you're in anti-Semitic territory, but asking the historical counterfactual question, well, what would have happened if it hadn't been created, and what kind of tshuva do we need to do? That is not, that's history. That's the same kind of history and tshuva that we need to do in the United States. It's not anti-Semitic.
Thank you. I think, the one other tweak on that comes up with folks that we're dealing with is people who perhaps aren't asking the historical question, are simply stating right now, they're against the existence of the state of Israel, right? They think it's, they think it's unjust, they think it's bad. And again, my answer to that is, first and foremost, obviously I disagree with that. But even someone who says, I don't think Israel should be there, they may be anti-Semitic, there may be anti-Semitic reasons behind that. But for instance, if you look at somebody who is Palestinian or of Palestinian descent, and they say, okay, my family lost their home in 1947, and they lost both homeland, but literal home, and have been refugees since then. Is that statement, is that person saying, I wish that Israel didn't exist, that didn't happen? Again, I think it's problematic in a lot of ways for the reasons you were just talking about of sort of reality today, but I don't think it's by definition necessarily anti-Semitic. And that is, there are a lot of folks in our community and in the political space who ever draw their lines at different places. There are a lot of people who, again, are out there pushing the perspective that really almost any criticism, opposition to the occupation is anti-Semitism, or any kind of criticism of Israel is anti-Semitism. And I think there's a different category of folks that say, no, that's okay. And part of the challenge of this, and this is where we start to get into something that is also in your guide, the IRA definition versus the other definitions, is people, including the IRA definition, says it's okay to criticize Israel. But the question is, how is that implemented? Because many folks who rally around that and push for the codification of that, I'm yet to see the criticism of Israeli policy that they think is okay. It is theoretically okay. What do you think is important for folks to understand about the differing definitions?
Sure. Well, the IRA definition, I'm going to get the initials wrong, but the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, is that right? All right. Definition was created as a way of describing anti-Semitism. It was particularly created in Europe in order to describe and keep track of anti-Semitic incidents, and in particular when there was what was even beyond criticism, but violence that was couched as a political disagreement with Israel, but became directed against Jews. For example, somebody firebombs a synagogue in Germany because they're mad at Israel. That's not actually a legitimate expression of your anger at Israel. That is now anti-Semitism and also violence.
And terrorism, yeah.
So that it was created as a description. It was never meant to be legislated. And even one of the main framers of this definition, one of the main writers, has said very clearly that this is not something that was ever meant to be put into legislation. And so the definition, which you can take a look at it online, it's a very short definition, but then it gives some examples. And the examples on the face of it are not necessarily problematic, except that the way that they've been implemented are problematic. So for example, there's one example that says holding Israel to a different standard than other countries. So we can look at that and say, well, holding Israel to international human rights law is not actually holding it to a different standard than other countries, it's holding it to the same standard. But the way that it's been implemented is to say about pro-Palestinian activists, well, if you're just doing activism about Israel and not about other countries, you're being anti-Semitic. So unless you're also campaigning for the Uyghurs or now maybe for Ukraine, then you're being anti-Semitic if you're just boycotting Israel, for example. So that's one of the, and human rights, I mean, in human rights, you always have to make decisions. I mean, our organization, TRA, only works on North America and Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories because we can't do everything and we'd rather do a few things well. And other organizations work on other countries. So you always have to make choices. And I would also say that if I decided to devote my whole life to fighting for the Uyghurs, then as somebody who's never been to China, has no relationship to China, doesn't speak a word of Chinese, et cetera, I don't think anybody would say to me, well, you're being anti-Chinese, and because how dare you only focus on the issue of the Uyghurs and not on any other issue, or tell me, you don't understand the security issues, even though I don't know, I've never been to China. So you're always making decisions, but it's been used, for example, the IRA definition has been used. There's an ongoing battle about Students for Justice in Palestine at Fordham University. They've been kicked off campus and back on, and it's ongoing, and lots of other places where there's been legal action against, usually it's against SJP, Students for Justice in Palestine, which whether you agree with them or disagree with them, they're a student activist group. They have the right to do activism. They have the right to do activism that one doesn't like. So the IRA definition has been implemented in that way to go after pro-Palestinian activism, including in legal means, particularly happening at universities.
I will add the Kansas State House passed a resolution endorsing the IRA definition yesterday. So this is really real-time work. And it's certainly been, there's been a lot of focus on universities, but we're seeing an international effort with both the government of Israel and frankly, many American Jewish organizations and others pushing for countries to adopt the definition, for states to adopt the definition, for universities, for civic bodies, large global companies. So there's been a push, and it's quite clear. I mean, some of those pushing that, I think, have been honest about it, that they're doing it as a way to address what they see as anti-Israel sentiment. One of the things that has come out of this greater push around the IRA definition, and you address this in the booklet, is two new definitions that people that were created in response to the situation, let's say. Can you tell us a little bit more about those?
Sure. So there's two definitions that were created and published around the same time involving different groups of scholars, or in some cases crossover groups of scholars. One is called the Nexus Declaration, or the Nexus definition, and the other one is called the Jerusalem Declaration. It's called the Jerusalem Declaration because it was crafted through the Van Leer Center in Jerusalem, though virtually, but I think the idea was for it to be in person originally. And both these definitions are much more, and these definitions are also not meant to be legislated, they're also meant to be descriptive, but they are much clearer about what the difference is. I mean, they give a general definition of anti-Semitism and some general examples that don't have to do with Israel, but then they're just much clearer about what the difference is between criticizing Israel and anti-Semitism. And so it's something that can be used to say, for example, just to take one example of something that happens on college campuses, putting up a wall and having in the middle of campus and having apartheid week and standing in the middle of campus and educating students about Palestine or doing activism about Palestine, whether you agree with it or disagree with it. I think all of us might agree or disagree with lots of campus activism that happened while we were on campus. So doing that is not anti-Semitism, that's criticism of Israel. Going to Jewish students' dorm rooms and slipping flyers under the Jewish students' dorm rooms that says, you've been evicted, with something about, as has happened in at least one campus, now that's anti-Semitism, because now you're targeting Jewish students and you're making the assertion that Jewish students are somehow responsible for everything that's happening in Israel, right? So both these definitions, Nexus and JDA, they have some differences, but they're very similar, and they're both very, I think, very good. You can also find the full language online or get the brief description in our booklet. They are just much clearer and allow for a wide range of criticizing Israel, including boycotting Israel. Boycotting is protected free speech. And for the possibility of being able to say, I don't agree with this, but it is protected and it is a legitimate form of activism, even if I personally might not engage in it.
Right. By the way, for everybody who's following along in the chat, Ori has just posted the IRA definition and the Nexus and the Jerusalem definition all in the chat. So you've got the links there.
Amazing.
Jill was just
Thank you,
mentioning.
Ori.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we see, this phenomenon that's sort of grown in the past few years, that broadly I put under the category of sort of the weaponization of anti-Semitism, really speaks to what you were just talking about, which is the difference between I disagree with that, or even that's wrong, and anti-Semitism. And like we said, the example earlier that I used of someone who literally believes there shouldn't be a state of Israel, I think that's wrong. It isn't by definition, I don't believe, anti-Semitic. And that's very different. I mean, that's kind of the extreme. There are so many cases where people are faced with something that they don't like because somebody said something about Israel. And I think this goes to what you were talking about before, Jill, about Israel being central to the identity of so many American Jews or others, that they feel criticized and attacked when somebody attacks Israel, regardless of whether what they're saying is true, is accurate, whether you like it, etc. And it's become a thing that is very different from what we used to see from official Jewish communal responses, whereas, that any of those criticisms are deemed anti-Semitic because they are uncomfortable and they are unpleasant in a variety of ways. And that may be uncomfortable and unpleasant because you agree and you think it's true, and it's uncomfortable and unpleasant because you don't want Israel to be doing that, or it may be because you disagree, right? And again, those people may even be wrong. But one of the things that, having been at this for a while now, 10, 15 years ago, we used to actually see American Jewish organizations really clearly delineating between this is anti-Semitism and should be fought against as anti-Semitism versus these are people we disagree with on Israel issues. And I go back to, issues around the Presbyterian Church and some of the Protestant churches where they started putting out statements critical of the occupation or other things. And organizations, we had a whole conference at an organization I worked at 15 years ago about that difference and proactively stating that difference, saying, these folks over here, we disagree with what they're saying about Israel, but that's not anti-Semitism, and these people are partners, and et cetera. And we've seen that flipped on its head, and we've seen it flipped on its head from sort of the highest levels of American Jewish organizational life and into our political discourse. And that's one of the questions that I want us to talk about a little bit more here, is that weaponization and how we see it showing up sort of in our political discourse, and frankly, how we address it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about, I'm not going to get the quote right, but you remember when Donald Trump said something about how it was about the moving the embassy, and he said something like, well, I did this for the Christians because American Jews, like, they're not really pro-Israel. Like, it was something to the effect of like, American Jews are disloyal because they're not pro-Israel, meaning supporting the right-wing then government of Netanyahu and the settler agenda. And I think that just the actual quote was better than how I represented it, but that just sort of encapsulates where we've come, where there's a sense that even Christian Zionists who are hoping that we'll all go to Israel so that we can be swept up in the apocalypse and just be basically tools for their end times vision, that they're considered more pro-Israel than American Jews who are actually fighting for there to be justice in Israel for both Israelis and Palestinians. So that's kind of a the extreme that we've gotten to. But for sure, I mean, you didn't ask about BDS in particular, but let me just talk about BDS for a second, because that's a place in which the mainstream American Jewish community and mainstream organizations have just basically all agreed that BDS is anti-Semitic and have been supporting BDS laws in many, many states. And I think more than 30 states at this point have passed some sort of BDS law.
Anti-boycott.
And have now been supporting. I mean, we saw this last summer when Ben and Jerry's decided they weren't going to sell inside the settlements. They weren't even boycotting Israel. There was just almost a unified voice from mainstream Jewish organizations saying that's anti-Semitism. And now there's a lot of support for the pension boards in different states that, because of the BDS laws that already passed, now find out that they have to divest from Unilever. So there's this sort of overwhelming voice from too much of the Jewish community saying that boycotting Israel or even the settlements is anti-Semitism. And so first of all, again, I remind everybody, Israel is a country. If I were boycotting China, or I think we're all boycotting Russia at this point, right? There's major sanctions. That is not considered to be
Sanctions,
prejudicial.
by the way, yes, in BDS.
Yes, exactly. So that's not, I don't think anybody's going to accuse me of being anti-Chinese or anti-Russian because if I'm carrying out those boycotts, because Israel is a country. So there's a difference between if I as a Jew walk into a store and the owner says, oh, I'm sorry, I can't serve you because you're Jewish. That is against the law. And if an Israeli citizen walks into a store in the United States and the owner says, I can't serve you because you're Israeli, that is also against the law. But for a company to decide that they're not going to sell in Israel or China or Russia or any other country, that is protected free speech. And certainly for an individual person to decide that they're going to boycott, that's legally, constitutionally protected free speech. And so we've seen situations in which, because of these laws that are passed, like I said, they're all written different ways to apply in different cases, but we've had situations where somebody is invited to speak at a university, and a public university, and then they're disinvited because it turns out they're boycotting Israel, or somebody's hired as like a occupational therapist in a school, and then they're unhired because it turns out that they signed something saying they're boycotting Israel, or they're proactively, I mean, the case that Sutra and J Street together have filed amicus briefs in a few different states around in Arkansas, Georgia, and Texas around cases there. And the one in Arkansas, which is particularly egregious and also the subject of a new movie called Boycott by Just Vision that you should all see. In that situation, there was a newspaper, the Arkansas Times, that writes about local Arkansas news. They are really not interested in foreign policy. They don't write about foreign policy. And they get a lot of their funding, a lot of their ad revenue comes from one of the university branches, one of the campuses of the University of Arkansas. And they were told that once this law passed, they had to sign something saying that they wouldn't support a boycott of Israel in order to continue getting this ad revenue. And the publisher basically said, we don't talk about Israel. We don't care about Israel. We're a local Arkansas paper that reports in local news, but being a newspaper, we're not going to sign away our First Amendment rights. And so they now became the plaintiff in this lawsuit. And something that's very striking, to go back to the extremes, if you watch this movie, Boycott, you'll see that one of our rabbis, a Trua rabbi who's been very vocal and we've worked with a lot, Rabbi Barry Block, talks about, who's the rabbi of not only the largest synagogue in Arkansas, but as he keeps telling me, it's bigger than all the other ones put together, in Little Rock, big Reform synagogue. And he talks about why the Jewish community supports the First Amendment. It's really important for us. It's what makes it possible for us to even be in this country, and to live as freely as Jews in this country. And he talks about why he doesn't support this law, and also that nobody from the legislature came to talk to him. And then throughout in the movie, they're interviewing one of the legislators who helped to introduce this law. And this legislator originally had said that he introduced the law because he really cares about Jews and he really cares about Israel. And then they cut back to him after they've interviewed Barry, and the same legislator says, well, I didn't see any reason to talk to the local community, Jewish community, because we don't really agree on things. And then later on, he basically says something like, anyone who's not, Jewish, Christian, whatever, who doesn't believe in Jesus is going to hell. So you can see those are the people who are supposedly our friends, but actually not. And so Tura's amicus that we did with J Street in these 3 states says, we personally don't support boycotts of Israel, and we also believe that free speech, that boycotts are constitutionally protected free speech, and part of supporting free speech means supporting speech that one doesn't agree with. And that is a really important line, I think, for us to draw as a Jewish community, is there might be some criticism of Israel that is really hard to hear, or like Hadar said, that is just blatantly wrong. Like it could be, right? There's no law against being wrong. And people are wrong about history all the time in public, all day long. And so you could say, you know what, that's wrong, or I don't agree with you, or let's argue about it, but it doesn't mean that it's anti-Semitic. And just
or against the law.
Yeah, or against the law, or should be against the law. And I'll just add that now there's a bunch of efforts by ALEC, the Republican bill writing organization, to create bills, some of which have already been introduced, or I think one that's already been passed in different states, that are basically essentially the BDS bill, except instead of saying the state can't do business with people who are boycotting or divesting from Israel, instead it talks about fossil fuels or weapon manufacturers. So we see where that it was kind of a testing ground for seeing how else we can push on free speech.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's so much here. First of all, Ori shared the link to Boycott, the movie that Jill referenced in the chat. Also, I would strongly encourage folks to see it when that's possible. Right now, it's out there in the sort of film festival world. It's going to be at South by Southwest soon, and we have partnered with Just Vision on a number of things. And when the time is right in a few months and they get past some of these festivals, are going to be doing some partnering and screenings, et cetera, of the movie as well. It's really powerful. And, I started off by talking about how we, APN and Trua, have been working together in some of these places. So these anti-boycott bills, as they're referred to, are in states all across the country. There are 34 that have some version, either a bill that passed through their legislature or an executive order in some case. For instance, in Maryland, where I live, the legislature didn't pass it. So the governor instituted it as an executive order, and that's happened in a number of states. And there are others that have it under consideration right now. Alaska just had an anti-boycott bill introduced, because obviously, the top priority of the legislature of Alaska should be making sure that no one boycotts. And it's important to note, it's not just what's required, and it varies a little state by state, but it's not that you sign something saying that you aren't boycotting Israel or haven't boycotted Israel. It's that for any kind of state contract, state employment, sometimes it goes as far as to speak on a panel to a state body, whatever it may be, any interaction with the state, you have to sign something promising that you have not and never will in any way boycott Israel. So if you want, and as has come up, Jill talked about the case of somebody who was an occupational therapist working with children. There in Maryland, it was a case of somebody whose company literally wanted to have a contract to clean the carpets in public schools. What that has to do with Israel, Palestine, occupation, or anything else remains unclear to me, but they did not get that contract because they refused to sign a document saying that they would never boycott Israel. And there are institutional questions, but like Jill said, think about it on the personal level. I will tell you myself right now, sitting here, if I go to a store and I am buying wine, I am not buying wine that is grown, from grapes grown and produced in the occupied territories. That's my personal choice. I personally have been called anti-Semitic because of that within this framework, more than once. And, thankfully, I don't work for a state, but if I wanted to get a contract for any one of those 34 states, if I was honest about that, I wouldn't be able to get it. And so we see this playing out on the multinational company Unilever, Ben & Jerry's level, but also down to the personal level. One of the questions that somebody had posted that I think is interesting to think about is, does that determination of whether a statement is anti-Semitic or not, of course it depends on context. We always talk about on context, is one of those things that it depends on whether or not the person who makes the statement is Jewish or not. And again, I just gave my own example. I've been called anti-Semitic for my views or not buying West Bank wine. So, but what do you think, Joe? And how do you address that question?
Yeah, I mean, anti-Semitism, sure, there's always context. And I mean, Jews know that we poke fun at ourselves all the time. And it's probably one of the main contributors to our managing to survive through so much. And so for sure, if I, if I in with a Jewish group, make some comment about Jews or poke fun at us or something like that, it's very different than if a non-Jew says that. And that's always true in group, out group, right? You always have different conversations in group and out group. And there's also, I mean, also there's always internalized prejudice. So as Jews, there's certain things that we've internalized for our history, just like women have internalized sexism, and right, so like there's internalized racism, there's internalized every ism that there is, and so there might be cases in which Jews are joking around, but maybe it does cross the line. So it's very hard to give a blanket rule, but for sure, context is always important. Yeah,
and I'll just add to that. Of course, the context is important, and I think to me there are differences. Again, if someone is joking, if somebody is wrong, if someone is malicious, again, a joke doesn't mean automatically make it okay, but it is different. I definitely have seen cases where I think, there are Jewish people who do or say something that I do think is anti-Semitic or hold views, because it goes back to what those are. If there's somebody who is Jewish who is, blaming all Jews for the actions of the government of Israel or equating those two, I think that fact, right, equating Jews and actions of the government of Israel, I think is at its core anti-Semitic. And so I've seen Jewish people do that too. So that's just my addition, my thought on that. Another question that came up, it's a little bit of a different look, is, looking at some of what was called here the less visible sort of strains of anti-Semitism. And you touched on this a little at the beginning, Jill, the belief in Jewish power, right? That the shooter in the Pittsburgh synagogue, talked about that. Obviously, the recent case in Texas where the rabbi and others were taken hostage was because, the person who did that did so because he thought the Jews would have power to make change somehow. Basically blaming Jews, both ascribing too much power, but then blaming for the negatives. I guess the question, that overlaps with Israel. To me, there's a clear core anti-Semitism there, but how is that different than some of the other ways you see it popping up?
Yeah, so there's anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that, date back to the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was an early 20th century forgery that, if anybody's not familiar, that suggests that it's the transcript of a meeting by Jews who are controlling the world. And so unfortunately, that, first of all, continues to be a very popular book and is reprinted and unfortunately read, and people believe it. But it's since then there's a unfortunately very popular anti-Semitic conspiracy theory that says that Jews are somehow the people behind all of the events in the world. The Jews are somehow pulling the strings, and particularly the Great Replacement theory, which we've seen come up a lot in white nationalism, this idea that Jews are the ones who are, like you said, Hadar, moving refugees in order to destroy white America. or Jews are the ones who were behind the civil rights movement. This is also very racist, because how could Black people possibly be smart enough to run a movement like that? It must have been the Jews were somehow pulling the strings. So you get to be anti-Semitic and racist at the same time.
Super.
And yeah, so that sense that Jews are behind things. And I really encourage people to read almost anything about white nationalism. But one book that I found very helpful is Tal Levin's book. What is it called? Cultural. I'm sure Ori will find it in a second, but it's basically Tal goes undercover in white nationalist chat groups and just sees how they're talking about not only Jews, I mean, also Black people and immigrants, but like very much how anti-Semitism undergirds that whole movement.
Yeah.
So,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so that is very terrifying, and it is one of the places in which criticism of Israel does cross the line into anti-Semitism, when you see sometimes very familiar anti-Semitic images like the octopus that I mentioned before, with the tentacles over the world, and you'll see that instead of being a stereotypical image of a Jew, it'll be Israel, or it'll be labeled Israel. Or when you see suggestions that like Zionism is behind, like 9/11, for example, right? Israel, Zionism are behind these world events that are, just giving Israel that kind of outsized power that is, if you sub in Jewish, then you would hear the protocols right in your head.
Yeah. One sort of quick question that I'll answer on the APN front, and then Jill, you can add. Someone noted that there are repeal movements underway regarding those anti-boycott bills in several states, and wanted to know if we were involved. So I'll say, for APN, we've been involved in a number of them. And again, there's an umbrella movement that pushed them, and we are pushing back collectively, but they're also really individual. Not only do they need to be dealt with in each legislature, but again, some of them are executive orders done by the governor, so they need to be dealt with differently. And the bills and the orders themselves are not exactly the same. They all fall under the category of sort of, criminalizing or making illegal, I should say, BDS. So we are working very actively. I'll just be really honest, spending a lot more time on it than I would have thought in a number of states. And so for anybody who is interested in that, who's involved or would like to be involved in that, please let me know. And Jill, I don't know if you want to speak to the state efforts at all before I go to the next question.
Yeah, so I mentioned that we have some amicus briefs in, and the Arkansas case in particular is likely to go to the Supreme Court. So the status of that case is basically, it was ruled unconstitutional, appealed. There's an expectation that the appeal, it was referred to the full appeals panel, and there's an expectation that that's not going to go well, so it probably will get to the Supreme Court. So then, for better or for worse, there will be a ruling on this. So far, there's been a number of these laws haven't been able to pass constitutional muster when they've been, and so what's ended up actually happening is that the laws end up getting rewritten so that they don't apply to anybody, which is still bad precedent. So it's like, it'll say anybody who has $100,000 or more of business with the state, like there's a number that will exclude all of the occupational therapists and the rug cleaners and the speakers. So it's like practically, it doesn't actually apply to anybody, but it's still bad law and bad precedent.
It is, and these anti-BDS bills have been getting a lot of attention this last year, primarily around Ben & Jerry's and Unilever, but they're not new. Most of them were passed, the law was passed or the order was issued 5 years ago, 6 years ago, 7 years ago. And it's a good lesson for all of us, because we saw Jewish federations, JCRCs, ADL, HAC, APAC, et cetera, pushing these, right? Those are the organizations, along with, it should be noted, CUFI, Christians United for Israel, and other right-wing Christian groups who played a very outsized role. Again, to go back to the boycott movie, in some of these states, it was the Jewish voice on this was really incidental. It was really Christian. But all of those Jewish organizations did support these and do support these. And people largely kind of, scoffed at them, ignored them, said, okay, whatever, this isn't really important. It's not doing anything. It doesn't matter enough, and now we're seeing them after the Ben and Jerry's statement, and we were seeing others. Illinois is going after a Morningstar now, and so I think it's an important lesson to all of us that when there is bad policy being moved, even if they change it, even if they write it in a way you think it's not, really practically going to matter, that it's important to address those. Okay, Jill, here comes the big one that we managed to not talk about yet, which is Amnesty International and their report, which, as you might have heard, uses the word apartheid as applied to Israel. So we've got some questions in there about it, and noting the fact that obviously for a lot of people who they see that, they immediately equate it to South Africa, and they don't know beyond that, don't read beyond that. What do you think? What do you think about the report, about the accusations of Amnesty being anti-Semitic? And actually, let me rephrase that. Feel free to tell us what you think about the report, but I don't want to go into the weeds of it. What I really want to talk about is the response by the Israeli government, and which clearly called it anti-Semitic. The American government, frankly, thankfully did not use the word, but did pretty much dismiss the report. And many members of Congress and many right-wing Jewish organizations, and frankly, not just right-wing Jewish organizations. And so, personally, and I'll hand it to you in one sec, I'll say, I think there were a lot of problems with the report. There were a lot of challenges with the report, and that were important to address. And that's very different than saying no one should look at the report because it's all just anti-Semitism. So take it away. Tell me about Amnesty.
Yeah, the report, first of all, the report was 280 pages and like 8-point type. So, no, I don't think a lot of people actually read it. But that said, it's a long human rights report. There are some things that I agreed with and that Troy agreed with. There's things that we didn't agree with, right? We don't think that all of Israel is apartheid and has been since 1948, right? So but reasonable people can argue about that. There is a legal definition of apartheid. It's not only about South Africa. It grew out of South Africa, but now it has its own independent legal definition. So people can argue about, is the West Bank apartheid? Is all of Israel apartheid? Like, you can have a legal argument about that on legal terms. It's not anti-Semitism. So to go back to, you can disagree with people, you can think that they're wrong. It's not anti-Semitism. And we did have that massive response by the American Jewish community that came from the Israeli government that was specifically asking American Jewish organizations to put out a specific statement. There was a lot of pressure from there and from some of the bigger national Jewish organizations to put out specific statements. And it does, again, cloud the field that it makes it harder to say when criticism of Israel actually crosses over into anti-Semitism if you have lots of people who are crying wolf all the time and saying that it is always anti-Semitism or almost always anti-Semitism, and who aren't able to say, I really disagree with that, and I think you're wrong, right? And we can argue about that, but it's not anti-Semitism. And that does make it harder to call out anti-Semitism, because when in situations where we do see it, then you have people who are just kind of burned by the weaponization of anti-Semitism, that they say, oh, well, that can't possibly be anti-Semitism because I was just talking about Israel. But actually, sometimes it is anti-Semitism, and we can't call it out because there's so many false accusations of anti-Semitism. We can call it out, but it's harder to be heard.
Yeah, and I'll, without putting any names on it, that goes up to really the, high levels in government. I have had conversations with elected officials, who have said things that I think are problematic, where I've said to them, I think that's wrong. And they've said, well, what are you talking about? We're being critical of this thing, or we're pushing back against this organization, and, needing to explain that line. And it's unquestionably, somebody put a question in here on this around, the sort of crying wolf frame, that when every statement that is critical of an Israeli policy or an Israeli action or et cetera is, attacked by the same set of organizations and people as anti-Semitism, it dulls that sense of, for people who don't live in this every moment, right? For people who are just trying to make a statement, it dulls that line. And it's the result that you see of folks on the right who have been trying to erase the line between criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism. Unfortunately, sometimes they succeed, and people who are trying to be critical of an Israeli policy without knowing stray into anti-Semitism because that line has been so thoroughly blurred. One other thing I want to just note real quick, Elaine Rubin, thank you, posted in the comments that, you know, there is the Israel Strategic Affairs and ALEC and others who are pushing these laws, but that there are, along with things like the amicus that Trua and J Street and others have done, CARE and ACLU are pushing back against these anti-boycott laws. Although I say this again, you know, I've been engaging with the ACLU around this. They've done really good work in a number of states. It's an ongoing conversation, kind of state by state, to try to build these coalitions and to try to come to agreements about what's the best strategy to address these. And again, it depends on exactly what's in that legislation, and it depends on whether it's a bill or an executive order. So, you know, we, APN and Trua and other allies in the Jewish community are working with folks like ACLU or CARE or individuals who are leading some of these lawsuits to push back on these. With that, I see
I'll just say, yeah, I'm just going to say that we're working closely with the ACLU on this, and their voice is really important because, of course, they believe in the First Amendment and they're totally agnostic about Israel. They don't care what it is that you're boycotting. It's about the First Amendment rights. So they're doing amazing work in many of these states.
They are indeed, and again, you know, they bring a different perspective to this, and they bring a very different expertise and capacity than certainly we do as well. And so it's one of the things that is always an important part of our work, is figuring out who are the allies and who are the partners, and how can we fight back against these. Thank you very much. And again, Ori had posted as the very first comment in the chat a link to that. You can also find it on the Trua website, I am sure. So with that, Jill, I will say again, thank you. Thank you for joining us and for this conversation. Even more importantly, thank you for the ongoing partnership and for all the great work that you and Trua are doing.
Thank you so much, all of you, to Hadar and Ori and Jim also for hosting me. It's always wonderful to be with you all.
Thanks. And a reminder to everybody, this will be recorded. You will be able to see on our YouTube page, and we will send it out, a link to the webinar and the podcast episode. So thanks, and we will see you all soon. Goodbye.